Hey everyone, thanks for sticking around.
Hey everybody.
I was going to say, hey Leo, welcome to Europe. Do you make it out to Europe often? But I didn't realize you were actually born and raised in Europe. You're Austrian, which I only found out about an hour ago. So welcome back to Europe, I guess.
Yeah. I live in New York City now, but I do spend some time in Austria. My family's there, so I actually use this opportunity for this trip to go there. Spent the last couple of weeks there.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. I doubt there's anyone in the room that doesn't know about Buffer. I'm still going to ask, what's Buffer?
Yeah, I'm curious. Who knows about Buffer? Your show of hands?
Who uses Buffer?
Very cool. That's exciting. Yeah, we build a social media management software. We help you organize, schedule, analyze all your social accounts, social profiles, and that's basically what I've been doing for the last five and a half years or so.
Ever since you dropped out of college,
which
is another thing I learned.
Ever since I dropped out of college, I went to school in the UK actually, not too far from here, to Warwick Business School. I met my co-founder, Joel, there, and eventually we decided, let's try and go to Silicon Valley, try and really turn this into a real company. And luckily, after a lot of ups and downs, we were able to kind of move forward from there.
Nice. Well, maybe take us back to the beginning. When you started Buffer, did you already know about software as a service and all these models and all these different distribution mechanisms, or did you have to learn everything along the way?
Yeah, we were totally green. I think that some of the things I think are often helpful to talk about is because we had no background in SaaS or even building startups. We were both sort of first-timers. And the most interesting trend that we were lucky to be part of was this idea of content marketing. So early on, we discovered that it's actually really, really useful to build and write content and to distribute that to the world and kind of see if people, once they find value from you, get value from you via content, eventually become your customers. So that was really one of the biggest lessons in terms of distribution to discover this value-based idea of content marketing.
Yeah. Right. So you also got lucky in terms of timing.
Yeah, very lucky. If you start that today, I think it'll be much harder to scale.
Sure.
But we were sort of fairly early, I would say, at that time. Yeah.
Right. When you started the company, did you have any? I'm going to say competition, but did you have any companies that you looked at that you aspired to, that you were inspired by?
Yeah, I think at that time, there was a company called Hootsuite that's still around. Many of you will know them. And basically, the main functionality of Buffer was kind of, we were using Hootsuite and there was some things were lacking, and so we went off and built our own. So like a lot of inspiration came from kind of the things that they weren't doing that we thought we could supplement. But generally, I think from a business model and also from a culture perspective, there were companies like Moz or MailChimp or Zappos at the time that really inspired us from the perspective of how we want to kind of build the company and also the company culture especially. Great.
Well, this was your first company. It still is your first company. So you also had to learn everything about company culture and hiring the right people and retaining them. And so how was that for you? Was that a smooth experience? Or?
Yeah, no, that was really hard. It continues to be hard. We recently had a very tough period at Buffer. We went through some layoffs where we had to lay off about 10 people. And as a founder, that's one of the hardest, toughest things you can go through. And you think, before we were kind of getting a lot of good comments on Buffer and like the way we approach culture, and we continue to do so, which I'm grateful for. But then you go through layoffs and it's like, well, like we don't know at all really some of the things that you come across. And I think for me it's a real learning experience. And I've recently written an article about this idea of going from a maker to a manager, and like Paul Graham wrote this famous essay a while ago. But for me personally, that continues to be one of the biggest challenges, where as an entrepreneur, and everyone in this room is probably a founder, where you first start to or many are founders or want to do that at some point, where as a real maker, right, you do stuff and you make stuff happen, and you rally and you get those early customers, or you do the early marketing. But then over time, as you build that team to really make that transition to functionally and kind of efficiently and effectively lead a team, lead other people when you're no longer in the driving seat. I think from a culture perspective, also from a personal perspective, that's by far the hardest, most difficult thing, I would say.
Right. Interesting. You mentioned when you started, it wasn't like a linear line. It's more like this. So what are some of the things you learned while you went through that period of figuring things out in terms of how do we scale this thing? How do we get the monetization right, distribution, the marketing?
Yeah, I think very early on at Buffer, one of the biggest things we learned from a SaaS perspective, which is very obvious today, is kind of monthly and yearly pricing, right? So one of the biggest things when we first worked on Buffer was that we didn't know quite how do we scale, how do we just even sustain ourselves, like get Raymond profitable. And we were selling monthly subscriptions to Buffer, and that was like the first few hundred customers. And eventually we really focused on yearly pricing, which really fundamentally changed our cash flow. And I think really understanding those levers, when to push them, when to leave them, I think that was one of the biggest learnings. Another really huge lesson for us was early on kind of to learn about fundraising. So when we first came to Silicon Valley, it was almost impossible for us to even get any conversations going with investors. They weren't kind of interested. They weren't kind of wanting to talk to us. We were like these 20-year-old kids that didn't have anything to prove, anything to show, and so overcoming that and learning about the pitch deck and learning about like how do you effectively talk with investors to how do you create the biggest learning there was that the story you tell customers is different from the story that you tell investors, which is a very obvious learning for probably everyone in this room. But for us, that was one of the biggest things that we had to go through. And up until that point, we were actually not really succeeding until we actually figured that out. And I think today, we really still, now we are doing about $12 million ARR. And it's a point where you then really think about how do you keep growing, right, at a pace that you're excited about and you're happy with. And a lot of the early levers that you explore don't work so well anymore, right? Like these ideas around, just more customer acquisition, just more that's not. And there was this great talk, I think, from Patrick from Price Intelligently, who said, like, you need to think about the other levers, right? Like, and that's really where future growth is coming from, and that's really what we started to explore and learn about. So that's why that other shift in dynamic of how do you grow is I think another really interesting learning for us.
There was another interesting talk this morning by Des Traynor from Intercom. I don't know if you caught it, but he was talking about the fact that you have different kinds of thinking about starting a company, either your sales first or your marketing first or your technology first. And he was talking about probably the best way to start a SaaS company is product first. Would you consider yourself a product first company?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think we are a very, very product-first company. We don't have a sales team for one, and we have a very small marketing team. And I don't necessarily say that with pride. Like, we could probably grow a lot faster with a larger sales team, or we could grow faster with a much bigger marketing team. But we are extremely focused on sort of crafting a product experience that we think will help, our customers. So I definitely subscribe to that.
But I find it very particular because on the one hand, you went to Silicon Valley, you went through the fundraising mode and all of the classical type of startup things.
Right.
And then not having a sales team shouldn't be like a badge of honor. It should be, why aren't you growing faster than you actually are? If you can, why don't you do it?
Yeah, I think for us, we've just never really been fully, in a way, comfortable to take on all the extra dynamics that come with building a large sales team, and that I don't just mean I mean mostly like raising more money, right? Like building, taking on more investment, having someone on the board. Like right now, it's just Joel, my co-founder, and I, which are on the Buffer board. We are the board, and so there's a lot of freedom that we have in running the company with this low touch model where people come and we give them a good experience with the product. They pay us small amounts, and many of them do. And the idea of a sales team, even though it's very appealing from a pure revenue and quote unquote like bottom line perspective hasn't fully made its way into us wanting to lean into that. So there's a number of dynamics that have not made us feel fully comfortable with expanding with the sales team at this point.
Yeah, fair enough. You mentioned this earlier, but you have about $1 million monthly recurring revenue at this point. And I remember off stage you told me you were sort of hoping for $1,000 a month just to pay the rent in the beginning when you started the company. But obviously that probably wasn't linear growth. So what are some of the things that triggered like the big milestones, getting to 100K, getting to 500K?
Right. I think one of the biggest things we've ever done at Buffer was just one of the simplest things I think anyone can replicate is we doubled our prices. So at some point the Buffer main plan was $5 and we made it $10. And we lost 0 conversion from doing that.
That means you got the pricing wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So someone, when I said that, I was really happy when we had those results, and I went to someone and said, like, look, this is what happened. And they said, oh, that's not great, because now you don't know how far you could have pushed the price in the first place. So we're now actually in the middle of running another pricing experiment and earlier this year we increased prices as well.
So basically the trick is to double your prices every year.
Increasing price is a very underrated and not thought often enough in terms of your positioning or playing with prices in general. I think we often that's why I'm so excited for Patrick's talk earlier today. I think I just see us trying to figure out so many companies and startups figuring out monetization so much, whereas tinkering with price, especially as you scale, especially as you have like the levers are incredible, right? If you can just move that a little bit. And I'm not saying I'm at Buffer our philosophy is really not to squeeze the last dollar out of every customer. That's not at all what we're about. Our approach is much more to think, what's the true value we're providing to a business, and how do we represent that with the dollar value that we're charging them? And I think those two have to be aligned, right? And if you keep on building and building and building value, but you don't have that reflected in your price, you just, almost undervaluing yourself and not doing either yourself or your customer a favor.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. So no sales team, there's more things that you do differently from most startups. One, the fact that you don't have an office. Mm-hmm. So you have a completely distributed team, I think about 85 people.
Right.
40 cities around the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Does that help you grow? Or is it just something that you wanted to have in your company?
Yeah, I mean, originally the reason we have a distributed team is much more personal, right? Like that's how Joel and I wanted to run the company, because that fits our lifestyle, and I'm a big believer in setting companies up in a way that it fits your lifestyle, instead of just doing what you think is the right way to do something, or run a company that you think is the right way to do it. And there's huge amounts of benefits from being remote, right? You can hire talent anywhere across the world. Anyone can, you just have much better distribution in terms of, time zones when it comes to customer service or even marketing. There's also huge challenges that come with being remote, right?
What are some of the major downsides?
Well, one of the biggest challenges I think is for us is brainstorming, right? It's just really difficult to remotely, when you're not in the same room, to brainstorm and have a debate or discussion without a full-on agenda where you just riff on things and you go left and you go right and you scribble something down on a whiteboard. That's really challenging. We're trying to figure that out. We're trying to do that, and we're supplementing with sort of once or twice a year we call it Buffer retreats, where everyone gets into the same room for a week and we hang out, we get some FaceTime in, and that's really, really key. But I think that's a big downside. I mean, time zones can be challenging as well, right? Like if you have product teams, especially working across many different time zones, that can be, you have to really over-communicate and learn how to, be on top of things. So those are a few things that I would say are difficult.
So pros and cons, like everything, I guess.
Absolutely.
So we talk about growing and growth, but growing, in terms like scaling and growth, mean different things to different people. Growth for you, what does it mean?
Right. I think the idea of growth, especially when it comes to a growth team, is fairly misunderstood when it comes to like many of the startups I've talked with. And the definition that I like to go by is that when you focus on growth, you're focusing on demonstrating more value to your customers. That's the definition of growth, demonstrating value to customers. Versus focusing on product is building value for customers, right? So kind of matching growth and product, where one is you demonstrate the value to customer and product is you building the value. Like those two need to go together. And when you think about growth as demonstrating value to customers, you also frame yourself and you're set up much, much better to really think about growth across, throughout your funnel, throughout all your metrics, and not just acquisition. When you think growth hacking, we oftentimes too much on the, exactly on the start of the funnel. So like if you think about just what can I do to demonstrate value better, that's really the only way you can get growth, right? In my mind, the only way is to demonstrate the value that you already have better. And you think about how can you do that best, you tend to have much more interesting ideas than if you just think about, acquisition.
Interesting. I assume that you have a proper growth team. Do you actually call it the growth team?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, it's a growth team. Yeah.
What's the setup? How many people are in there? What are their roles? What are their personalities? What do they do?
Yeah, I think so. At Buffer, we have one growth PM. We have one designer, one engineer, and then a second sort of researcher, junior, associate PM. And what I find really important when you put the growth team together, who in this room has a growth team in their company? Is show of hands? There's a few. Awesome. It's still fairly new, and you only need it at a certain stage. But it's really about the mindset that every startup needs to have. I think a growth mindset. And what we find is that the cadence of the growth team is extremely different from the product team, right? They're really focused on shipping smaller iterations much more quickly. It's much more results-oriented, much more data-driven.
One of the things that stuck with me in the preparation for this conversation was that you said one of our biggest mistakes was putting someone from the product team on the growth team.
Right. Yeah.
Why was that such a big mistake?
So what we did, we had someone on our product team lead both product teams and growth teams at the same time. Even the same engineer is doing the same tasks. And that's just so detrimental because it means that you need to split your brain between creative long-term tasks of building a new feature where you build value with shorter, really results-oriented tasks where you're shipping experiments. So what happens is that you either end up doing one or the other, whichever one you truly, I think one person is always either one or the other. They're either full-on data and sort of growth demonstrating value-minded, or they're full-on product and creative and building value-minded. And we had that one person do both, and they were just struggling so much. And I think David Cancel, who I had a conversation with, I don't know if he's in the room, I think he gave a talk here today. I once talked with him about this, and he said, that's insanity to put that person in that position. And I thought that was a really good way to phrase it, because it's really our fault to put someone in a position to execute both on growth and on product at the same time.
Interesting. I keep forgetting the title of our actual panel, but there was something in there about the science of experimentation, so we'll talk about that as well. When I hear experimenting, I hear A/B testing, but there's probably a lot more to it than that. So I'd love to know what you think experimenting means within the startup context, obviously.
Yeah, I think so it's really interesting because most companies actually don't have, especially in SaaS, right? If you're an enterprise company, don't actually think that much about growth. They think about, they have a sales team, which in most SaaS companies fulfills the need of a growth team, which again, by my definition, it's to demonstrate value of your product. It's the salesperson that demonstrates the value of your product to your customers. And it's not the onboarding flow or just the landing page or just the stuff that happens within the product where Buffer is fully self-serve. So that's in our case. I just want to preface this with you can take those same concepts and apply them actually to your sales team in the same way that you can do with a growth team, where a growth team focuses on no touch, whereas sales team is obviously high touch when you actually talk with the customer. But for us, it's really about thinking, how do you improve what your product already has to offer without building anything new, right? So like your product is, you sell, you sell a breakfast, right? And it's like eggs and toast, right? So like, how do you better demonstrate and explain to your customers that this is, what it is you're selling? And if you have enough traffic, then A/B testing can be really great. You can say, if I say, hey, this is the best breakfast in the world, or like, hey, this is the English breakfast, you can, take those two kind of copy ideas and test them, run them against each other, and see which demonstrates the value of the product that you've built better, right? So I think that's A/B testing, and is generally very, very, very good way to do that. But if you can't, I think what we generally look for is we look at what are the general behavioral numbers that we know we need, or we know are good metrics. And even though you can't quote unquote A/B test it, you can still look for those behaviors and keep on making small tweaks and see whether those that behavior is affected. So to give you an example, at Buffer we have something called true activation metric, right? Which is when you sign up to Buffer, you post social media content on Buffer, we know that there's a positive, you're not activating just by signing up and connecting your Twitter and Facebook account. You're not activating by posting 1 time to Twitter and 2 times to Facebook. The true activation metric we have in place is to post 15 times on a social channel in the first week. So we know if you do that in the first week, there's a very high chance that 3 months later you will still be an active customer, right? So we call this in SaaS typically your a leading indicator, right? Or like in the lean startup, it's like your leading indicator for having a long-term sustainable, healthy customer. And so what we started to do is really look for those behaviors, right? If you know that's your metric, but you don't have enough data to run an A/B test, you can still see whether any of these metrics are affected if you change any of your flows or pages, or those sorts of things. So looking for those strong, customized SaaS metrics where you say like, activation is different for every startup, right? Even like, what churn means is different for every startup, right? Where you think like, oh, sometimes churn only kicks in after 3 months, sometimes after 2 months, or when you're paying for a month and then you churn, it shouldn't be true churn, right? Sometimes it's, if you're paying for 2 months and you churn, it's still not true churn, or like paying for 3 months and you churn, it's still not true churn, right? You have to really understand the customer, how they move through your product, and then always looking for those, how are those particular metrics being affected as you iterate and make tweaks and create new flows, like a new onboarding flow, or a new pop-up, a new button, a better way to demonstrate the value that the product you already has. Yeah.
Pretty obvious to me that this is something that really takes away a lot of your time that you think about quite a lot. So it's a combination of A/B testing, but also analyzing patterns and like tweaking along the way. But I'm wondering, do you also do qualitative research? Do you actually go to customers and ask them, like, what do you think? Do you do surveys? Do you do this kind of research?
I think it's hugely important and generally very difficult on growth, right? Like, it's really easy to do great customer development if you have a product, right? If you have a new feature, you say like, hey, I want to test this brand new feature instead of on my breakfast instead of eggs and toast, I want to add, selling beans on top of that, right? You can make a prototype, right, and go to a customer and have them eat their breakfast, and then can ask them, what do you think, about that, and how do you feel, and like you can even ask them before them, what is missing from our product, and you can do all these great things in customer development, especially when you improve your product and you build more value to your product. But understanding, doing qualitative research on growth is generally much more difficult, but equally important, right? So the way I think about growth is like, if you're doing well on growth, if you checking the box of 4 big components that you need to have at all times, and whether that's an experiment or an iteration or something else. And the first one is I think it starts with vision, right? So like, how is this aligned with your vision? Like the best example I think is Facebook, where they say they often take losing A/B tests and make them the new new version of something because it aligns more with the long-term vision of where the company wants to go. And so that's really important to keep in mind, so you don't purely follow, just data. And like I think someone famously said, if all you do is, follow the data, eventually we're all making porn, right? Because that has the best conversion, right? And so,
well, why not?
Right? So, like that's why you want to really have a strong vision of why you're really building, iterating on something. And I think the second, next to your vision, is sort of your intuition, which is your experience. There's certain people, and there's people that I know, like for example Heaton Shah, or like I'm sure Patrick is now one of them, where they have so much experience, they've seen so many experiments, even without giving them any data or qualitative research. You can just put a problem in front of them and ask them what they would do, and even though they don't have any data, their intuition for what to do next could be very spot on. So like you want someone who's experienced, who is excited about data, who's run a lot of experiments in the past. And oftentimes we actually discount intuition. And I think intuition from someone who has run 1,000 A/B tests is extremely good. Like you want to trust that person's intuition, even though they might not make a decision based on data. And then we use, obviously data itself, right? You want to be really versatile on data and analyzing data, and then using qualitative research really, really well. And so what we have found is in order to do that well when it comes to growth is, there's obviously, onboarding surveys that you can do, or like, there's this one method that I like from, I think Qualitative, kind of like this, it's like a surveying tool. They, for example, put stuff on you can put it on the question, one of the most useful questions they've discovered. I think Sean Ellis is obviously one of the most well-known people on growth. He put that on the landing page where it pops up and it asks you, what's keeping you from signing up for a product at this point? And like that's a really, really smart way to ask someone and learn about kind of how can you demonstrate value better, and not how can you build more value, right? So then you can tweak your landing page based on what you learn. Another thing that I really like to do is to combine qualitative and quantitative research, is to think about row-level data analysis. So we use something called Looker, and what I like to do is so 5 people down here all signed up for Buffer, and I go into Looker, which is our data tool, and I look really, really closely, like action by action, what they've taken, what they've done, right, and track that really closely so I can see, okay, this person has done X, Y, and Z, and they clicked on this button, then it did this, then they connected this account, then they went back, then they did this and this. So you don't talk to the customer, and you don't do aggregate data analysis, but you do row-level data analysis. It still doesn't give you the why. So, quantitative research gives you the what, and then the qualitative research gives you the why. But at least you're one step closer to then talk and jump on with those customers and say, I noticed, at some point you connected this profile here, what was your reason, or why did you do that? So I think combining all those 4, and like especially in the context of growth, thinking hard about how do you do qualitative research well is difficult, but really important.
Great. Absolutely great insights. Thank you very much. We're out of time, but I'm still going to leave some time for questions, the last session anyway. Does anyone have any question for Leo? We have 2. You go first. I'll repeat your question. So I'd
like to sort of dig a little deeper on the qualitative research part. So how do you decide what to even focus on? And so one of the challenges I found is, what are the questions we ask? What do we actually, how do we, has a lot to do with ideation. How should I use qualitative research to really drive my ideation?
So when you say ideation, you mean building features or improving? Oh, right. So the way sorry?
Or should they always be obvious?
No, I think it's never obvious. I think it's a really good. I think understanding the key drivers of your business, like that's obviously where I would start with my research, right? So at Buffer, the key driver of a healthy user is they post through social media a lot. They post on their Twitter account, right? And so that's really the metric I want to understand inside and out, right? And so I go and, yeah. Right. Right. Yes, yes, absolutely. I love that. So I think you're asking the wrong questions, right? You know, don't ask customers what they want, right? Like the main hypothesis of customer development, as far as we've learned it, is you walk up to customers and you ask them about, you know, how they do something or what problems we have. You don't ask them what they want you to build next. And so there's a great book that I can recommend that I think might change your life on that. It's called Lean Customer Development by Cindy Alvarez. And it's really great. It gives you an interview script for how to interview customers to get real insights from customers. Because what happens, and I see this all the time, companies go and talk with customers and they don't ask the right questions, and they get a bunch of stuff and they build that, and then it doesn't work, and it isn't what customers actually then don't like it. And so I think understanding how to interview customers well with you know, a proper customer development interview script is really, really key. You can actually also Google, there's a script, I can also send you the script we use at Buffer. It's kind of really questions, like one of my favorite questions is around really understanding your customer's day, you know, what they do in a given day, and that has almost nothing to do with your product. This has almost nothing to do with, but you know, if the better you understand your customers actually just pure workflow, the better you can see, this is what takes time, and this is where they get emotional about. And if you ask them, you know, what do you want us to improve about this product, you never exit this pain zone, which is oftentimes pain is, in terms of pain that you experience when using something, when doing a certain task, is oftentimes not expressed with something, you know, specifically focused, but something that they tell you about when it says, oh, yeah, I do this and it takes me an hour. Then you notice, and you listen, shit, this takes this person an hour? Like, you know, clearly we're not solving the problem well of this. We need to, you know, focus in on this.
It's clever. So lean customer development.
Yeah, lean customer development. Does that help? Great.
So we have one other question. Make it short because we're out of time.
Sorry,
reward the users, yeah.
Reward users for being beta customers? Beta testers, like a, like a, yeah. Right.
So do you give early access to new features and other things to good users?
Right. Absolutely. I think that's really important. The thing that I would suggest, though, is what we always find is who are really good beta customers, right? And it's not always the people that actually scream the loudest. It's sometimes those that are the quietest, but that are so busy using your product and building great stuff. Those are actually the people you want to try and get a little bit of time from to beta test something. So I believe not necessarily in rewarding users for being beta testers, like by price discounts or anything like that. I don't know if that's what you mean, but I just think about, like, you know, what's the real customer that has that pain point that you want to solve this problem for, and give it to them, and do it that way.
All right, thanks for the question. We're going to wrap up. Leo, thank you so much
Cool.
for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well
Appreciate
done.
it. Yeah.